Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Los Pirineos wash processed El Salvador from Tim Wendelboe. And there's the bag right there. And Tim Wendelboe, based out of Oslo, Norway. And their coffee roaster has appeared on this channel a number of times over the years, including our recent review of the Caragoto, a wash processed Kenyan coffee. And both that Caragoto as well as this Los Pirineos were Tim Wendelboe's 2024 Christmas coffees. And while I originally had no intention of reviewing this one, we did have a couple of people reach out to us asking if we could review it, largely due to the praise that Tim Wendelboe had for this coffee, calling it the best Los Pirineos that they had ever had. So we decided let's go ahead and take it on, and we'll see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 44. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Tim Wendelboe's recipe, which is a 15.38 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 100 degrees Celsius, about 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So while we did mention in the Caragoto review that we found that one to be on par with a number of the other Tim Wendelboe coffees that we'd reviewed in the past, this one did feel a little bit more developed, and it could have been a byproduct of what this coffee is, as it is an El Salvadorian Pacamara, but certainly didn't feel quite as light as that Caragoto. But even then, for what this coffee is, it's still on the slightly lighter side of things. So people could say that this is either on the more developed side of that light profile or on the very, very light side of that light medium by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee was certainly intense right from the start, as it was offering plenty of the expected Tim Wendelboe characteristics in terms of brightness and herbality, and that's been a theme with so many of the Tim Wendelboe coffees that we have reviewed and discussed in the past, to go with plenty of the traditional Central American characteristics to it. A pretty full, robust, kind of bold coffee in general, so definitely on par with a lot of the expectations that I did have for it. And going into it, looking at the flavor notes, I said, yeah, this coffee really doesn't sound like my type of coffee, and that's one of the main reasons why I didn't necessarily want to review it at the start. But given the high praise, I said, okay, let's roll with it. So we continue on to day 19 as we opted for the Chemex, and there was a similar impression this time around, as it's still offering plenty of the winey characteristics, and that is one of the notes that they do have on here is wine. And I wasn't afraid that it would have a more fermenty or kind of heavier alcoholic like sense to it. I assumed that that wininess would probably be presented in maybe the brightness of this one, and I can certainly see that, as it did have that level of acidity that you can kind of find with some more fermented coffees in general. That being said, it was a pretty dominant and distinct characteristic to this coffee, as it did give it a slight Kenyan-like feel, given that it was very, we'll say, darker berry forward in that sense, as well as plenty of intensity with a strong herbality yet again. So very Tim Wendelboe-esque, I should say, for this coffee, and it's no surprise that Tim Wendelboe appreciated and enjoyed this coffee as much as he did. We move on to day 22 as we opted for the April brewer, and there were similar results and consistency, as this coffee does continue to offer an abundance of traditional Central American characteristics, including a pretty prominent chocolate-like aspect to it, and even some nutty attributes to go with a high level of wine-like brightness, acidity yet again. Red fruits predominant, as there's been an overall increasing intensity, which is saying something given that this coffee was pretty intense right from the onset. Day 25 through the V60 with Tim Wendelboe's recipe, and the coffee is the best it has been to this point, as it feels like it's continuing to open up, which once again is in line with our previous expectations, or I should say experiences with Tim Wendelboe's coffees. It does have a bit more of the intensity and brightness, and a very long-lasting coating finish that is in line with the listed notes, as it really seems quite pronounced and intense within this coffee. We move on to day 28 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee is the most intense it had been to this point, offering so much more intensity and robustness with a very prominent red berry aspect in a slightly heavier sense, and once again plenty of that winey brightness. And that, for me, not necessarily, none of those qualities are anything that I really look for and enjoy in coffee too much. I was just kind of going with this one, as I said in our Caragoto review, that I really wanted to lean into what these Tim Wendelboe coffees are supposed to be. So I really felt that this was certainly leaning into those attributes, especially given that that's not just the way that this coffee is described, but also the way that I would expect a coffee in this fashion to go for Tim Wendelboe. day 31 to the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is improving. So even though I'm not necessarily enjoying the profile of this coffee too much, I should say the flavor profile of it, I was appreciating just what it was representing, as the flavor separation was much better, as there's a little bit more depth to that tropicality. Otherwise, it's very Kenyan-like once again, with still plenty of that brightness to it. And given that it just really seemed to lean into that aspect, it wasn't necessarily something that I was enjoying too much, but I still appreciated the coffee and the direction that it was going. Day 34 through the chemics with our standard recipe, and this was actually my least favorite day of the coffee up to this point, as it felt even more robust, even more heavy, as it did have a little bit more of that traditional heaviness to it, contrasted by that wine-like brightness, and even this time a raisin-like feel to it. Some darker chocolate aspects to this one as well, especially within the base. So this one just went a little off the rails for me. So first time we'd seen a little bit of inconsistency with this coffee, or most of Tim Wendelboe's coffees, I should say. And on day 37, we opted for the V60 with Tim Wendelboe's recipe one more time, and it is intense, as previously stated, offering a combination of classic Central American characteristics and a, we'll say, well above average level of brightness for what this coffee is. Plenty of wine-like components, very pronounced, richer, heavier, dark chocolate to go with a lot of the darker berry tones to this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a number of level 4s, so let's go through them. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So even with a lot of the characteristics that we've described in this coffee, I would say that it was still on the cleaner side of things. I mean, there was really nice flavor separation to it. The brightness was pretty well defined. That wine-like attribute to it was pretty well defined. The fruit profiles were pretty well separated from that as well, and the chocolate is pretty defined and pronounced as well. So I could definitely see level 4 in terms of the clarity for this one. If I recall correctly, this is the first truly only washed Los Pirineos coffee that they have ever released. So I think by that standard, it should be the cleanest, and I would say that it's clean, and I should say clean for what it is for the most part. Finish level 4. I had pretty mixed feelings on the finish, and I don't think that'll come as a surprise given that the finish came in two very heavy and distinct manners, that of course being the darker chocolate-like aspect to it, and then also the brightness, which did seem to linger a fair bit. And those are two characteristics that I'm just generally not the biggest fan of, as I don't drink alcohol pretty much whatsoever, and I don't really like chocolate, especially darker chocolate. So neither of those two things characteristics that I really appreciate in coffee either. So while they were quite pronounced, they weren't necessarily in line with my own preferences, but yeah, that's mostly what I was getting from the finish in this one. Acidity level 4, I discussed that as probably the first note within this coffee, and it was the most noticeable and consistent thing, as it was very pronounced the entirety of the time that we were consuming this coffee, and it was present right from the onset, the first sip you took, all the way until the very last sip. As it did cool down to room temperature, you were just getting so much of that brightness within this coffee. Berry fruit, level 4. And I could definitely see a little bit more of those, we'll actually say darker berry aspects, but I could also see a little bit more of that grape. And I think that goes in line with the fact that this one does have that wine-like characteristic to it. So a lot of those being presented within this one definitely pushes that to that level 4 mark. Chocolate level 4, and it's always interesting seeing a lighter profiled coffee, but given that this one is, as mentioned, not necessarily the lightest Tim Wendelboe coffee that we've ever reviewed, and it also is an El Salvadorian coffee, a Pacamara at that too, I think a lot of those chocolate characteristics could be expected, but chocolate was presented in a very heavier, darker sense. And that's why I do want to highlight one thing on this tasting wheel real quick before we move on to level 3s, and that is that smokiness at that level 2. That's not to say that there's a roastiness to this one, as I didn't pick up too much roastiness or a roast profile to it. That smokiness is representative of the dark chocolate aspect, as it has that very, just we'll say, heavier, much more higher percentage cacao sort of dark chocolate feel to it. And that's why it's there, but not insinuating any sort of roasty qualities to this one. A couple of level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness level 3, and yeah, that's going to be the biggest sticking point for me on this coffee. Is the other characteristics in this one definitely seemed to dominate it, a little bit more of that heavier chocolate, and of course the brightness. Those were significantly higher than the sweetness in this coffee, so having that scored there at the level 3 isn't necessarily ideal for me. Florality level 2, I just wanted to touch on that real quick because florality is one of the most important characteristics of a coffee for me, and this one was almost muted, if non-existent, within this coffee. And then the other level 3s, we have just one other one, interestingly, and that is the body level 3. fully expected on this coffee, as well as the Pacamara coffees and El Salvadorian coffees should in theory have a little bit more body and texture to them, and this one certainly did, making this tasting wheel alongside the Caragoto. I felt that both of them had a little bit more body in general. Outside of that, as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I don't think that there's anything else worth discussing. I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It goes back to what I said with the Caragoto review, that I do appreciate the fact that Tim Wendelboe picks and releases coffees that's in line with his own preferences, but I've also said so many times in the past that his preferences and my preferences are two very different things, as he does really like these overly bright and herbal coffees, whereas those are two characteristics that aren't necessarily things that I enjoy. And this El Salvadorian coffee acted like an El Salvadorian Pacamara coffee in so many ways, especially with that very rich and intense feel to it. But what separated it from those other coffees was the fact that it just was that bright. And it's really interesting to me that a coffee like this can turn out that bright. And I feel like that's why Tim Wendelboe was such a huge fan of this coffee. I feel like it's much more in line with his own preferences. So it's not really surprising that this coffee wasn't necessarily for me, but in the same vein that I've said with a lot of Tim Wendelboe's coffees in the past, I appreciate it for what it is, but I'm going to be completely honest. I'm happy that I'm no longer working with this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you really like those brighter characteristics with a little bit more of a traditional feel, then this one's a very interesting coffee in that sense, because it has both of those two components, and you usually don't see those go with each other too often, as it definitely had a lot of that wininess, a lot of that brightness, and it's just so prominent and present throughout the entirety of it, while at the same time it acts a lot like a traditional coffee. I mean, you're getting a lot of those chocolate components, you're getting a little bit of that nutty quality to it, you're getting a little bit of that herbal spiced quality to it. At the same time, you're still getting a little bit more body and texture to it. So a lot of those traditional characteristics, a lot of what you expect from a Pacamara coffee, with that very interesting and unique contrasting brightness that just gives it a little bit of a different feel and characteristic to it. Probably the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been your review of the Los Pirineos wash processed El Salvador from Tim Wendelboe. Thank you for watching.